The frozen prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, white and merciless. And somewhere beneath that howling wind and ice, Faith Granger was dying. 2 days had passed since her wagon had overturned, the wheel splintering against a hidden rock as the blizzard descended without warning. Her horse had bolted into the white void, and she had chased after it on foot, desperate and foolish, until the animal collapsed from exhaustion and cold. Faith had tried to revive the mare, but the creature's heart had given out within hours. With no other choice, she had pressed herself against the dead animal's belly, using its cooling body as a shield against the wind that wanted to strip the flesh from her bones. She had left Prescott, Arizona 3 weeks earlier, traveling north through Colorado territory toward Montana, where her brother supposedly had a homestead waiting. The journey had been brutal even before the unseasonable April blizzard struck. Now, curled beneath the stiffening corpse of her horse, Faith wondered if anyone would ever find her body or if the snow would simply cover her until spring thaw revealed her bones. Her fingers had lost all feeling yesterday. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes dreaming of her childhood home in Missouri, sometimes seeing her mother's face hovering above her in the swirling snow. The cold had stopped hurting sometime during the second night. That was when Faith knew she was truly dying. The body stopped fighting when death became inevitable. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. Only the wind answered, screaming across the frozen wasteland. She did not hear the horse approaching. She did not hear the man dismount or the crunch of his boots in the snow. She only became aware of another presence when strong hands gripped her shoulders and pulled her away from the dead mare. Faith tried to fight, some animal instinct making her struggle, but her limbs would not obey. Her eyes fluttered open to see a face above her, dark eyes filled with concern beneath the brim of a snow-covered hat. "Easy now," the man said, his voice deep and steady. "I have got you. You are safe now." Faith tried to speak, but only a weak croak emerged from her throat. The man wrapped her immediately in a thick wool blanket, then lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. She felt herself being placed across a saddle, felt the warmth of a living horse beneath her, and then the man mounted behind her, holding her securely against his chest. "My ranch is not far," he said, though she barely heard him over the wind. "Hold on just a little longer." Faith lost consciousness then, surrendering to the darkness that had been pulling at her for 2 days. When she next opened her eyes, she was lying on a bed in a small cabin, blankets piled high on top of her. A fire roared in the stone fireplace, and the man who had found her was crouched beside the bed, pressing a warm cloth to her forehead. "There you are," he said softly when he saw her eyes open. "Welcome back to the living." Faith stared at him, taking in his features properly for the first time. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a strong jaw shadowed with several days of stubble. His eyes were the darkest brown she had ever seen, almost black in the firelight. There was a scar along his left cheekbone, thin and white with age. He wore a simple shirt rolled to the elbows, and she could see the muscles in his forearms as he wrung out the cloth in a basin of water. "Who are you?" Faith managed to whisper. "Name is Thomas Sutton," he replied. "This is my ranch about 15 miles south of the Colorado line. You gave me quite a scare out there. How did you find me?" Thomas set the cloth aside and reached for a cup of broth that had been warming by the fire. "I was riding out to check on my cattle when the blizzard hit. Lost most of them, I reckon, but I was trying to find whatever stragglers I could. Saw the dark shape of your horse against the snow. At first I thought it was one of my steers, but when I got closer, I saw you underneath." He helped her sit up slightly, supporting her head with one hand while bringing the cup to her lips. "Drink this slowly. Your body needs warmth from the inside." The broth was thin but hot, and Faith felt it spreading through her chest like liquid sunshine. She took several small sips before Thomas set the cup aside. Her fingers were wrapped in clean bandages, she noticed, and when she flexed them experimentally, pain shot through her hands. "You have got some frostbite," Thomas said, following her gaze. "Your fingers and toes both, but I do not think you will lose anything. You got lucky." "Lucky," Faith repeated, and then, inexplicably, she began to laugh. The laughter turned to tears, and soon she was sobbing, her body shaking with the release of 2 days of terror and certainty of death. Thomas did not try to stop her or tell her to be strong. He simply sat on the edge of the bed and let her cry, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder until the storm passed. When she finally calmed, Faith wiped her eyes with the back of one bandaged hand and looked at him. "I am sorry. I do not usually fall apart like that." "You just survived 2 days in a blizzard," Thomas said quietly. "I would be more worried if you were not falling apart a little." He stood and moved to the fireplace, adding another log to the flames. "The storm is still going strong out there, has been for 3 days now. Worst I have seen in 10 years of living here. You are welcome to stay until it passes and you are strong enough to travel." "I have no money to pay you," Faith admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. "Everything I owned was in the wagon, and it is somewhere out there in the snow." "I am not asking for payment," Thomas said firmly. "Common decency says you help someone in need. Besides, I could use the company. Gets lonely out here during the winter months." Over the next 2 days, as the blizzard finally exhausted itself and the wind died to a whisper, Faith learned about the man who had saved her life. Thomas had come west from Tennessee 8 years earlier, fleeing memories of the war that he did not like to discuss. He had built this ranch with his own hands, starting with a single-room cabin and expanding as the years passed. Now he had 3 rooms, a barn, and a decent herd of cattle, though he grimly admitted that the blizzard had likely killed half of them. "I will know for sure once the snow melts enough to ride out," he said as he prepared a simple dinner of beans and salt pork. "But I have been through bad winters before. The ranch will survive. It always does." Faith told him her own story as she slowly regained her strength. She had been born in Missouri, the youngest of 4 children. Her parents had died of cholera when she was 16, and she had spent the next several years living with various relatives who made it clear she was a burden. Her brother had written to her 6 months ago, telling her he had land in Montana and that she could come live with him and his wife. Faith had saved every penny from her work as a seamstress until she had enough for a wagon and supplies. The journey had been harder than she imagined, and now she was stranded with no wagon, no supplies, and no horse. "Montana is a long way from here," Thomas observed as they ate, "especially with winter still holding on." "I know," Faith said quietly. "I will figure something out. Maybe I can work in a town until I save enough for a new horse." Thomas was silent for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. Then he looked up at her, his dark eyes serious. "The nearest town is Oatman, back down in Arizona Territory, about 40 miles south of here. But it is a mining town, rough and full of men who spend their days underground and their nights drinking. It is not a safe place for a woman alone." "I do not have much choice," Faith pointed out. "I cannot stay here forever, and I need to get to Montana eventually." "You could stay here," Thomas said abruptly, then seemed surprised by his own words. He cleared his throat and continued more carefully. "I mean just until spring properly arrives. Another month or so. The ranch could use an extra pair of hands, and you could rest and heal properly before continuing your journey. I would pay you for your work, of course, enough to buy a good horse and supplies. Faith studied him across the rough wooden table. There was something in his expression, a loneliness that mirrored her own, that made her want to say yes. But she was also acutely aware that she was a young woman alone with a man she barely knew, miles from anywhere. Thomas seemed to read her thoughts. "I would give you the bedroom," he said quickly. "I sleep out here by the fire anyway, and there is a lock on the door if it would make you feel safer. I give you my word as a gentleman that I would never take advantage of your situation." There was such earnest sincerity in his voice that Faith found herself believing him. Besides, what choice did she truly have? The alternative was to set out alone across the snow-covered prairie with no resources and little chance of survival. "1 month," she said. "I will stay 1 month and work to earn my passage to Montana. After that, I need to continue north." 1 month, Thomas agreed, and when he smiled, Faith felt something warm flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Thomas bundled up in his heavy coat and headed out to assess the damage to his herd. Faith, still too weak to be of much help outside, cleaned the cabin from top to bottom and prepared a proper meal with the supplies she found in his pantry. Her hands ached terribly as feeling returned to her fingers, but she worked through the pain, needing to feel useful after days of helplessness. When Thomas returned that evening, his face was grim. "Lost about 60 head, he said as he shed his coat and boots. "Maybe more that I have not found yet. The ones that survived are weak and scattered. It will take weeks to round them all up." "I am sorry," Faith said, ladling stew into a bowl for him. "Is the ranch in danger?" Thomas sat heavily at the table and accepted the food gratefully. "It will be a lean year, but I will manage. I have been through worse." He took a bite of the stew and his eyes widened slightly. "This is excellent. Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother taught me before she died," Faith said, pleased by the compliment. "She said a woman who could turn scraps into a feast would never go hungry." "Your mother was a wise woman." They fell into an easy routine over the following days. Thomas would rise before dawn to tend to the surviving cattle and repair the damage the blizzard had caused. Faith would prepare meals, mend his clothes, and slowly begin to help with the lighter chores as her strength returned. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk, sharing stories of their lives and their hopes for the future. Faith found herself looking forward to these quiet hours. When Thomas would sometimes play a battered harmonica, he kept on the mantel, filling the cabin with sad, sweet melodies that made her heart ache in ways she did not fully understand. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, Thomas came in from the barn with fresh blood on his shirt. Faith immediately rushed to his side, her heart pounding with alarm. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "It is not my blood," Thomas assured her quickly. "One of the cows was calving and ran into trouble. I had to help pull the calf out. Both mother and baby are fine now." Faith sagged with relief, then felt foolish for her strong reaction. But Thomas was looking at her with an odd expression, something soft and wondering in his dark eyes that made her breath catch. "You were worried about me," he said quietly. "Of course I was worried," Faith replied, trying to sound practical even as her cheeks flushed. "You saved my life. I would hate for something to happen to you." Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek for just a moment. "Faith," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, a loud knock sounded at the door, making them both jump apart. Thomas frowned and moved to answer it, his hand instinctively going to the rifle mounted above the door before he relaxed. Through the window, Faith could see two men on horseback, both wearing heavy coats and looking half frozen. Thomas opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Sorry to bother you, friend," one of the men said, his teeth chattering. "We are riding through to Oatman and got caught out in the cold. Saw your smoke and hoped you might let us warm up for a spell before we continue on." Thomas hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in. I will put coffee on." The two men entered gratefully, introducing themselves as prospectors heading to Oatman to file mining claims. They were polite enough, though their eyes lingered on Faith with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She stayed near the fireplace, her arms wrapped around herself, while Thomas served them coffee and made small talk about the weather and trail conditions. After 20 minutes, the men thanked Thomas for his hospitality and rode on. Thomas locked the door behind them and turned to find Faith still by the fire, looking troubled. "What is wrong?" he asked. "Nothing, I just—" Faith struggled to put her unease into words. "The way they looked at me, it reminded me that I do not belong here. That people will talk if they find out I am staying at your ranch unchaperoned." Thomas crossed to her side, his expression serious. "Let them talk. I know the truth of our arrangement, and so do you. That is all that matters." "Is it?" Faith looked up at him, her blue eyes searching his face. "Thomas, what were you going to say before they knocked? You said you needed to tell me something." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, the firelight casting shadows across his strong features. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful. "I was going to say that having you here these past 2 weeks has been the happiest I have been since coming west. This cabin has felt like a home instead of just a place to sleep. And I was going to ask." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I was going to ask if you might consider staying longer than a month, maybe staying permanently." Faith's heart began to race. "Thomas, what are you saying?" "I am saying that I have feelings for you, Faith. Deep feelings that I know are probably too soon to speak of, but I cannot keep them inside anymore." He took her hands gently in his, careful of her healing fingers. "I know you have plans to go to Montana, and I would never try to stop you. But I also cannot let you leave without telling you that I have fallen in love with you. And if there is any chance you might feel the same way, I would like you to stay here as my wife." The words hung in the air between them, enormous and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Faith felt tears pricking her eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear or despair. "I do feel the same way," she whispered. "I have been trying not to because I knew I was supposed to leave, but Thomas, every day I spend with you makes me want to stay more. I love the way you play your harmonica by the fire. I love how gentle you are with the animals. I love your kindness and your strength, and the way you make me feel safe for the first time in years." Thomas pulled her into his arms then, holding her as if she were something precious and fragile. "Then stay," he murmured against her hair. "Stay and build a life with me. We will make this ranch into something great together. I promise I will spend every day trying to make you happy." Faith pulled back just enough to look up at him. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." Thomas cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. Faith felt the last of her walls crumble, all the years of loneliness and wandering falling away in that single perfect moment. She had been lost in a blizzard, dying beneath a dead horse, and this man had found her. He had saved her life, and now he was offering her a future she had never dared to dream of. They were married 3 weeks later in Oatman, with the town's circuit preacher officiating and a handful of Thomas's neighboring ranchers serving as witnesses. Faith wore a simple blue dress that one of the neighbor women had lent her, and Thomas wore his best shirt and a new string tie. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when Thomas slipped a thin gold band onto Faith's finger, She felt the last piece of her broken life click into place. The ride back to the ranch took most of the day, but neither of them minded. The snow had finally melted, revealing the first green shoots of spring grass, and the air was crisp and clean. Thomas kept looking over at Faith as they rode, as if he could not quite believe she was real, and each time their eyes met, Faith felt her heart swell with happiness. "What are you thinking about?" she asked as they crested the final hill before home. "I am thinking about how close I came to not finding you that day," Thomas said quietly. "I almost turned back when the blizzard got bad, if I had been 5 minutes slower or taken a different path." He shook his head. "It does not bear thinking about." "But you did not turn back," Faith pointed out. "You found me and you saved me, and now we have the rest of our lives together. Everything happened exactly as it was meant to." That night, in the cabin that was now truly their home, Thomas made love to his wife with a tenderness that brought tears to Faith's eyes. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, he traced patterns on her shoulder and told her all the things he wanted to build on this land. A bigger house with multiple rooms for the children they would have, a proper barn for horses and cows and chickens, fences to mark their boundaries and gardens to grow vegetables and flowers. "It sounds perfect," Faith murmured sleepily. "Tell me more." Thomas kissed her forehead and continued to dream out loud, painting pictures of their future with his words until Faith drifted off to sleep, safe and warm and loved. The first year of their marriage was not easy. The loss of so many cattle meant money was tight, and they had to work from sunup to sundown just to keep the ranch running. But they worked together, and that made all the difference. Faith learned to ride properly, helping Thomas round up strays and drive the herd to better grazing lands. She learned to shoot a rifle to protect the chickens from foxes, and to treat sick cattle with the basic veterinary knowledge Thomas shared with her. In return, Faith transformed the cabin into a real home. She made curtains for the windows from flour sacks. She dyed with berry juice. She planted a garden that yielded fresh vegetables through the summer. She learned to preserve meat and fruits for the winter, ensuring they would never go hungry even in the lean months. And every evening, no matter how tired they would sit together by the fire and talk about their day, strengthening the bonds between them with each shared story. By the time their first anniversary arrived, the ranch was starting to thrive again. Thomas had rebuilt the herd through careful management and the purchase of several breeding cows from a neighboring ranch. The cattle were healthy and multiplying, and Thomas had even managed to hire a young drifter named Pete to help with the heaviest work. Faith had just discovered she was pregnant, and though they had not told anyone yet, the secret knowledge thrilled them both. "Are you happy?" Thomas asked one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Faith replied honestly. She turned to face him in the darkness, her fingers tracing the familiar line of his jaw. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not found me that day?" "Every day," Thomas admitted. "And every day I thank God that I did. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Faith Sutton. You and this baby we are going to have." Their son was born in February of 1878, during another harsh winter. Though this time Faith was safe and warm inside the cabin with a midwife from Oatman attending her. They named him James, after Thomas's father, and from the moment Faith held him in her arms, she knew what it meant to love someone more than your own life. Thomas was equally smitten, spending hours just watching the baby sleep and marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. "He is going to be a rancher like his father," Thomas declared proudly when James was just a week old. "Maybe he will want to be a doctor or a teacher," Faith countered with a smile. We should let him choose his own path. As long as he is happy and good, I do not care what he becomes, Thomas said, and Faith knew he meant it. James was barely walking when Faith discovered she was pregnant again. This time it was twin girls, born in the spring of 1880 during a thunderstorm that shook the cabin walls. Thomas paced the floor for 8 hours while the midwife worked, and when he was finally allowed to enter the bedroom and see his wife and daughters, he wept openly with joy and relief. They named the girls Mary and Ruth, and the cabin suddenly seemed both much smaller and infinitely fuller. Faith spent her days in constant motion, nursing babies and chasing a rambunctious toddler while still trying to maintain the household and help Thomas with the ranch. It was exhausting work, but she had never been happier. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, taking the children with him whenever it was safe so Faith could have a few hours of peace. James would ride in front of his father on the saddle, asking 1,000 questions about the cattle and the land, while the twins grew into strong, curious girls who feared nothing. The ranch continued to prosper, and by the time James was 5, Thomas had enough saved to begin building the larger house he had promised Faith on their wedding night. It took 2 years to complete, but when it was finished, the house had 6 rooms, glass windows, and a real wood floor throughout. There was a parlor with a proper sofa, a kitchen with a cast iron stove, and 3 bedrooms upstairs. Faith cried when she first walked through the completed house, overwhelmed by how far they had come from that single-room cabin where she had first opened her eyes to find Thomas watching over her. "Do you like it?" Thomas asked anxiously, mistaking her tears for disappointment. "I love it," Faith assured him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "I love it, and I love you, and I love this life we have built together. I never dreamed I could have something so wonderful." Thomas held her close, his chin resting on top of her head. "You deserve this and more. You deserve everything good in this world, Faith. You are the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I have ever known, and I fall more in love with you every single day." They made love that night in their new bedroom, with moonlight streaming through the glass windows and the sounds of their children sleeping safely down the hall. Faith thought about the woman she had been 7 years ago, lost and dying in a blizzard, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed. That woman had been alone and afraid, with no hope and no future. This woman was loved and cherished, surrounded by family and possibility. As the years passed, the Sutton Ranch became one of the most successful in the region. Thomas expanded into horse breeding, specializing in strong, steady mounts suitable for ranch work. Faith became known throughout Oatman and the surrounding area for her medicinal skills, learned through years of treating both animals and people with herbs and remedies passed down from her mother. Their home became a gathering place for neighbors, especially during harsh winters or difficult times, and they never turned away anyone in need. James grew into a tall, serious young man with his father's dark eyes and his mother's compassionate heart. He took to ranching naturally, and by the time he was 15, he could manage the herd as well as any grown man. The twins were inseparable, 2 halves of a whole, with Mary inheriting her father's quiet intensity and Ruth getting her mother's quick laugh and easy way with people. In 1887, when James was 9 and the twins were 7, Faith gave birth to their last child, a daughter they named Grace. She came into the world during a gentle summer rain, and from the start, she was different from her siblings. Where James was serious and the twins were energetic, Grace was dreamy and artistic, always drawing pictures in the dirt or making up elaborate stories. Thomas doted on his youngest daughter, building her a small writing desk where she could practice her letters, and letting her follow him around asking endless questions about everything she observed. Faith sometimes looked at her family gathered around the dinner table and had to pinch herself to make sure it was real. 4 healthy children, a husband who still kissed her every morning before heading out to work, a home filled with laughter and love. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for during those dark days before the blizzard. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas surprised Faith with a gift, a beautiful mare with a gentle temperament and intelligent eyes. "I know you lost your horse in the blizzard," he said as he led the animal out of the barn. "I thought it was time you had a new one. She is yours to ride whenever and wherever you want." Faith approached the mare slowly, her eyes brimming with tears. She had not owned her own horse since that terrible winter, always borrowing one of the ranch horses when she needed to ride. Having her own mount again felt like reclaiming a piece of herself she had thought was lost forever. "What will you name her?" Thomas asked. Faith stroked the mare's soft nose, thinking of everything that had brought her to this moment. The fear and cold and certain death, the miracle of Thomas finding her, the love and life they had built together from the ashes of her old existence. "Hope," she said finally. "I will name her Hope." Thomas smiled and pulled his wife into his arms, the mare standing patiently beside them. "That is perfect," he murmured, "because hope is what brought us together, and hope is what keeps us strong." The years continued to roll forward, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. James fell in love with the daughter of a neighboring rancher when he was 18, a pretty girl named Elizabeth, who shared his quiet nature and his love of the land. They married in the summer of 1888, and Thomas helped them build a small house on the eastern edge of the property. Within a year, Faith was a grandmother, holding James's son and marveling at the continuation of the family line. The twins went to school in Oatman, living with a respectable family during the week and coming home on weekends. They both showed an aptitude for learning that surprised everyone, and Faith began to dream of sending them to a proper academy in one of the larger cities. Thomas supported the idea, working extra hours to save money for their daughter's education. Grace remained at home, too young yet for school, but already showing signs of a keen intelligence. She learned to read before her 5th birthday, devouring every book Thomas could bring home from his occasional trips to larger towns. Faith taught her to sew and cook and tend the garden, but Grace's heart was always in her stories and drawings. In the spring of 1892, Faith and Thomas celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary. The ranch now sprawled across several hundred acres, with multiple barns, over 200 head of cattle, and a small herd of horses that were in high demand throughout the territory. They had weathered droughts and harsh winters, economic depressions, and the occasional conflict with rustlers. Through it all, their love had only grown stronger, tested and proven by the years. "You ever regret not going to Montana?" Thomas asked one evening as they sat on the porch of their house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "I know you had family there." Faith considered the question seriously. "I wrote to my brother years ago, letting him know I had married and settled in Colorado. He wrote back once, saying he was glad I was happy. We exchange Christmas letters now, and that is enough. This is my home, Thomas. You and the children are my family. I have no regrets about staying." Thomas took her hand, his thumb rubbing gently over her wedding ring. "I found you dying in the snow 15 years ago, and you gave me a reason to live. Every good thing in my life stems from that day. I love you, Faith, more than words can ever express." "I love you too," Faith replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved." They sat together as darkness fell, comfortable in the silence that comes from years of shared life. Inside the house, they could hear Grace practicing her piano lessons on the instrument Thomas had bought her for her last birthday. The sound of slightly off-key notes drifted out into the evening air, mixing with the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. "We have built something good here," Thomas said finally. "Something that will last beyond us. Our children and grandchildren will work this land and live in this house and remember us." "Yes," Faith agreed. "We have built something good." As the years turned into decades, the Sutton Ranch became a landmark in the region. James took over more of the day-to-day management as Thomas grew older, though Thomas never fully retired from the work he loved. The twins went away to school as planned, with Mary becoming a teacher and Ruth training as a nurse. Both eventually married and had families of their own, though they remained close to home and visited often. Grace, the baby of the family, shocked everyone by moving to Denver and becoming a journalist, writing articles about life in the frontier territories that were published in newspapers across the country. Faith and Thomas grew old together, their hair turning silver and their hands becoming gnarled with years of hard work. But their love never dimmed. Thomas still kissed his wife every morning before heading out, just as he had when they were newlyweds. Faith still prepared his favorite meals and sat with him by the fire in the evenings, listening to him play his harmonica. They celebrated each anniversary with quiet gratitude, remembering that day in the blizzard when their paths had crossed and changed both their lives forever. In the spring of 1912, as Faith and Thomas approached their 40th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. All 4 children were there with their spouses and children, filling the house with noise and laughter and love. James's son had grown into a young man who ran his own section of the ranch. The twins had 5 children between them, and Grace had finally married a fellow writer and brought him home to meet the family. As Thomas stood on the porch looking out at the gathered crowd of his descendants, Faith came to stand beside him. She was 70 years old now, her face lined with age but her blue eyes still bright and clear. Thomas put his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Look at what we made," he said softly. "All of this from 2 people who found each other in a snowstorm." "It is a good legacy," Faith agreed. "We have been very blessed, Thomas." "I would do it all again," Thomas said, turning to face her fully. "Every hard winter, every struggle, every moment of doubt, I would do it all again just to have you by my side." Faith reached up to cup his weathered face in her hand. "And I would get lost in that blizzard 1,000 times if I knew you would be the one to find me." They kissed then, a gentle press of lips that held 40 years of love and devotion. Their grandchildren, watching from the yard, cheered and clapped, and Faith broke the kiss to laugh, her joy bubbling up and spilling over. That night, after the family had scattered to various bedrooms and spare rooms throughout the house, Faith and Thomas lay together in the bed they had shared for 4 decades. The window was open, letting in the cool spring breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. "Are you tired?" Faith asked softly. "Always," Thomas replied with a chuckle. "But it is a good tired, the kind that comes from a life well lived." "Tell me again about the day you found me," Faith requested. She had heard the story hundreds of times, but she never tired of it. Thomas obliged, his voice low and soothing in the darkness. "I was riding through the worst blizzard I had ever seen, cursing myself for being foolish enough to venture out in such weather. The wind was howling like a living thing, and I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I was about to turn back when I saw a dark shape ahead. At first I thought it was one of my cows, but as I got closer, I saw it was a horse, and then I saw you curled up beneath its body. He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion even after all these years. I thought you were dead at first. You were so still and cold. But then I saw your chest move, just barely, and I knew you were still fighting. I got you onto my horse and brought you home, and when you opened your eyes and looked at me, I felt something shift in my chest, like my heart was waking up after a long sleep. I saw your face and thought I was already dead and in heaven, Faith murmured. You were my guardian angel. We saved each other, Thomas corrected gently. I was just existing before you came into my life. You taught me how to live again, how to love again. You gave me a purpose beyond survival. They held each other in the darkness, their bodies fitting together as perfectly as they had on their wedding night. Outside, the land they had worked and loved stretched in all directions, marked with their sweat and tears and triumphs. Inside, their children and grandchildren slept safely, cocooned in the home Faith and Thomas had built together. I love you, Faith whispered. From the moment you pulled me from beneath that dead horse to this very second, I have loved you with everything I am. And I love you, Thomas replied. My Faith, my heart, my home. They drifted off to sleep together, two souls intertwined so completely that they could no longer remember what it felt like to be separate. The years had been kind to them, but more than that, they had been kind to each other. Through every hardship and joy, they had chosen love, and that choice had made all the difference. Faith Granger had been lost in a blizzard for 2 days straight. Thomas Sutton had found her curled under a dead horse, more dead than alive, and had brought her back from the edge of death. From that desperate moment had grown a love story that spanned 4 decades, 4 children, and a legacy that would endure for generations. It was a story of survival and second chances, of hope found in the darkest moments, of 2 lonely souls who found each other against all odds and built a life worth living. And as the moon rose high over the Colorado prairie, bathing the Sutton Ranch in silver light, that love continued to burn bright, a flame that neither time nor hardship nor even death itself could ever fully extinguish. They had promised each other forever on that long-ago spring day in Oatman, Arizona, and they had kept that promise through every season that followed. It was a love forged in a blizzard and tempered by years of hard work and devotion, and it would endure long after they were gone, living on in the hearts of their children and the land they had nurtured together. This was their story, and it was complete.